Blog Talk Radio.
Everybody, you're joining us here tonight on the Rapid Radio Network, Current Talk Show. Join us for a lively discussion with Dr. Salvatore Pizzuro. He is eminently qualified to speak about advocacy within the disabled community from a legal and civil rights perspective. And you know, we also stray away from the topic at hand quite a bit, but that's okay. We're all friends. I'm sure Sal will keep us focused tonight. We have Julie O'Brien, Alfred Lawson, William Woodburn, and Jan Bidwell. Hopefully we'll get to in, but we're all a little under the weather because it's so cold. And I know there's a lot of snow in New Jersey, so I'm hoping everybody is going to be able to get to where they need to be to join in. Bibi, I know you have been very interested in reading all of Sal's materials. Were you impressed?
More than impressed. I would have to extend to Sal my highest respect and admiration for his dedication over so long a period and in the face of so many personal limitations in his early life, and in his unwavering loyalty to the cause of protecting the rights of the disabled, the handicapped, and people's mental illnesses. This is a truly extraordinary achievement. I do more than take my hat off to him. I place him in the first rank of men who've made contributions.
Were you impressed with his human rights work?
Well, yes, of course, and
because it is a struggle for basic human rights when you have a disability.
And to place the human rights issues in context, I was intrigued to see that Sal has drawn an analogy between litigation, particularly Brown versus Board of Education, and numerous instances of that analogy deserves to be explored in depth, and I hope we have an opportunity to do it.
Very interested to read. It was the American Bar Association who formed the original Commission on Mental and Physical Disability Law. You would have thought that a more government-oriented group would have done that.
Well, I can give you a bit of information about the history of the relationship between the civil rights movement and the disability movement in the law. Consistently throughout the 60s and 70s, lawyers in private practice donated enormous quantities of time to filing amicus curiae briefs and to representing litigants on a pro bono basis. It makes logical sense, because these litigants, in most cases, did not have the financial resources to hire elite attorneys. But it makes humanitarian sense also, because I think elite attorneys are in part elite because they see beyond the four walls of their office to the conditions of injustice that exist in the post-World War II American body politic. In particular, I can't help thinking that the analogy to Katrina, where so many people in New Orleans were abandoned, and just left to perish and die because there were no services, is analogous to a permanent and ongoing disregard for the needs of the disabled that has been has been continuing since Senator Harrison Williams sponsored in 1975 the legislation that now has grown into the IDEA in New Jersey.
What's that?
That's the subsequent act that grew out of the 1975 act. It's just returned.
Okay.
I don't have the exact.
Now, Sal serves as a member of the New Jersey Transit ADA Taskforce. I wish he was serving on the New York City one. It's just impossible to get a taxi in New York if you use a wheelchair, for instance. You have to just, it's fine if you have a motorized wheelchair, but if you don't, it's hard work getting around New York City. And not all of the metro stations, the subway stations, I should say, in New York City are wheelchair accessible.
Well, that's very strange because in most large urban areas in the United States, there have been many movements to achieve accessibility. In Washington, D.C., for example, at each of the four corners of a rectangular-shaped city block, curbs have been lowered so that wheelchairs don't have to bounce over the edge of the curb and down into the street. They're just smooth ramps enabling them to go right down into the street in order to cross.
Yeah, sure. There's some ramps. There's a little bit of everything somewhere, but there isn't enough of anything, and it should be everywhere.
Well, it should be, and I don't really understand the economics.
Well, in New York City, I do understand. It's because Michael Bloomberg was the mayor of New York. Well, he wasn't really the mayor of New York City. He was the mayor of the Upper East Side for, 3 terms he was in for? So, that was a pretty weird setup with him. And he really didn't do a whole lot for anybody unless you happened to be living on the Upper East Side of New York.
Well, this frames an issue that left off the pages of Sal's essay, which is the inertia about disabilities issues in state governments and the indifference to the suffering of the disabled, physically or mentally disabled. And I frame this issue because in this part of the 21st century, particularly with the emergence of the Tea Party, the very, very rich in this country seem to have no conscience at all about sharing the wealth, securing the safety net, and allowing themselves to be taxed for those purposes. How they got that way is something that requires a very, very large microscope focused very carefully for a long time.
Yeah, and that's one part of the show tonight, hopefully. I hope Sal is able to overcome the weather up there and get to wherever he's going to join us. And I don't know if you spoke to Julie or not this week to get an update on the unnamed hospital. I think we're calling it Death Valley.
Death Row might do.
But I was, anxious to hear from Julie or what the update on all of that was. Well, and we have a lot to talk to Jan about as well, because Jan has been recovering from her tough campaign. Although she enjoyed it, she is now trying to recuperate from it. Well,
the point that struck me in one of Sal's writings is that when he received the award in December of 2012 from the state legislature, he stated, and this really struck me, that the disabilities movement was just beginning. And that's a very ironic statement. Dr. Pizzuro has been working with disability issues since 1975 at the latest. He became a teacher of special education well before that. And now in 2012, he says the movement is just beginning. I hope we get a chance to ask him that question. It may be that the change of heart in Governor Christie in wanting to reduce the budgetary allotment for support for the disabled means to Sal that we're kind of starting over in New Jersey because we've lost the political momentum that we had in New Jersey in 1975.
Well, now you have said the magic words, Christie.
Are those magic words?
We have to talk about Christie. He's getting himself into some really bad trouble over the Port Authority appointees and the traffic jam in Fort Lee and whatnot.
Can you refresh my memory about the Port Authority?
He, of course, appointed all his own people as places became available, and he threatened, people say, a lot of the mayors, even the Democratic mayors in New Jersey, that if they didn't, throw their support behind him at election time, they'd be sorry. So one mayor, of course, didn't support him and was vocal about it. And this traffic jam was supposed to have been retaliation for that. So we don't know.
Well, from my research on Chris Christie, he's something of a chameleon, and his success is said by some to have been manufactured by the Democratic state legislature, and it may well be that deals were cut that improved his performance with the minority vote, the women's vote, but other research has indicated that he may be farther to the right than he appears, or appeared to be in his most recent political posture. In Washington recently, in fact today, the Congress reached a budgetary agreement that will fund the government through 2014 and 2015. And that may be an indication that there's going to be a peace between the extreme right of the Republican Party and the more centrist elements in that party. And if that happens, it may be that the work of leaders like Sal will have a more supportive political environment within which to pursue their causes. I would predict that to be the case. This next 2 years may be a very special window of opportunity because there may be federal pressure on states to do more than a lot of states have been doing. We need to talk to Sal about the states that have performed well and what the political context there was that made that happen.
Well, you know that Sal is legally blind.
Yeah.
You were aware of that?
Yeah.
I just think it's amazing. It's almost like the classic, if you're given lemons, make lemonade type of thing. It's very, very strange.
Well, technology has improved, enabling Braille to be highly useful both in reading and also in writing. So if a person can read the research in Braille and analyze it, he can write his analysis in Braille in a way that was not possible a generation ago. So that's how he's become such a high-functioning person, intellectually and professionally. There's technological support that wasn't available when he was in college in the early 70s. I think also that the educational movement that is focused on narrowing the digital divide through the use of broadband technology is significant, because there's a very strong movement in the telecommunications community to ensure that schools in at-risk states will have computer technology available and will have trained teachers available to assist at-risk students in learning the technology. So, to the extent there's an analogy between the role of educational technology in servicing the needs of at-risk students and the role of men like Sal, men and women in that field, to relieve the neglect of the disabled communities, again, political atmosphere may well be changing in ways that will help the cause of disabilities activism in many different areas. It has to break down on a state-by-state basis, and there has to be a federal support system, particularly for states that want to improve their performance in servicing the needs of the disabled. I wonder whether there are federal funds that are available at the state level for that purpose.
Can I stop you there for 1 second?
You can stop.
Julie, are you on the line?
I am on the line.
As am I.
And Margaret, I've been trying to talk.
I'm not sure what's going on
another
the board
line
this evening, but it's not cooperating very well. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me, Margaret?
I'm willing to pursue.
I can hear Julie. Can Maggie hear Julie?
Because
I can hear. I can hear Jan. You can, okay? Because I've been. I just put another phone because I didn't think anybody could hear me.
Mental illness issues, cultural deprivation is, to a certain extent, a handicap that is similar to the handicap faced by disabled people. To provide educational technology to narrow the digital divide is a service to people who are culturally disabled, just as taking institutionalized people with mental illnesses off psychotropic drugs is a service to the psychiatrically disabled community, which is, of course,
can I ask a question
as well.
about that?
I was particularly struck by the stories of
I'm
how
not sure he can hear me, Maggie.
Drugs are used in many state psychiatric facilities to simply drug the
that was an exciting sound. Can somebody hear me?
Maggie, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, I can hear everybody now. Thank goodness.
I can hear you.
Thank you.
Because I'd like to respond to the person who was just talking about the psychiatric medication.
Yeah, that was BB. Go on, Jen.
I have an echo. And this is it might be hard for me to say. As a therapist who's been working since 1960, well, I've been working as a therapist since 1972. Before the current psychotropic medications, before the SRIs and DRIs, the medications had horrible side effects and were, people who were institutionalized long term for reasons that were less than purely psychiatric. There were a lot of abuses, but I've seen. I've worked with the chronically and persistently mentally ill, and without those medications, schizophrenics live in a world of sheer terror. They have a neurological. It would be like keeping insulin away from a diabetic to keep antipsychotic and antidepressant medications away from the chronically and persistently mentally ill. I, as a therapist and somebody who's, had a patient come in and say, I need you to go to the Commission on Human Rights because they're stealing my thoughts. And the patient knew this because he could hear them talking to him through his cavities, which is a very common auditory hallucinations, are the most common hallucinations. We got that patient on medication, and within 6 weeks, he was gaining weight, he was employable. He always had to be maintained, and he had to be followed. We've done away with long-term psychiatric institutionalization, and I think it's a bad thing. I think we swung way too far. You cannot, you absolutely, I'm saying this as a professional, you can't stabilize somebody on medications in 3 days, and we only get 3-day holds on people whose brains don't fire right and therefore don't have accurate judgment as to whether or not they should stay in the hospital. Yeah. And when you're paranoid, of course you don't want to stay in a hospital. And the patients would always say to me, you're trying to control my thoughts. And I say, you're absolutely right, we are. Because your brain's not working right. So I see the disabled community physically. I'm disabled. I'm permanently disabled. And I see those people who have physical, mental illness is a physical disability. It's a neurological disability.
One of the complaints.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I thought you stopped, but go ahead.
No, go ahead. I just want to hear your response, Judy.
Well, one of the complaints in the literature that we received from Sal was that mentally disabled people are just being warehoused and drugs are being used not to alleviate their symptoms, but to simply pacify them and make zombies out of them. That seems to be the abuse that's most outrageous. Clearly, therapeutic value.
The thing is that we don't warehouse them. We don't even house them. The 10% of the chronically and persistently homeless people are chronically and persistently mentally ill. And we don't have housing. We don't institutionalize them. There are some people with affective disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and attachment disorder. It's like floridly psychotic people who absolutely cannot live on their own. They can't live on their own. And some now schizophrenics can be maintained on medication and be reactive attachment disorder really can't live. They can't. It's a very long story, but they really can't live without. They need to be institutionalized. Their brains just didn't form. It's a long story, but their neurological connections don't allow them to interact on a regular basis with people. I mean, and it's like saying. I go back to diabetes all the time because it's the pancreas simply isn't formed correctly. It doesn't produce the right hormone, and so a person can't live, without that medication. Of course, psychotics can live, but they interface more with law enforcement and the medical community. Are incarcerated more when they're not medicated. There is a really real thing having a severe mental illness. It's a real disability. And in the same way that someone who doesn't have use of their legs needs a wheelchair, it's just that for the mentally ill, you can't see their disability.
That's scary. That's the scary thing about it. Actually, Jan, I think Sal has joined us.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I think. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, Sal. This is Maggie.
Hi, Maggie.
And BB is here as well.
How are you, Sal? Good to hear you.
And we have Jan Bidwell, Julie
Hi, Sal.
Ryan,
Hi, Jan.
and Bob Woodburn.
Hi.
And
Yeah.
we're all anxious to talk to you about all the wonderful things you've done for everybody else.
What contributions do you believe are your most significant, Sal? In ways
Gee, I don't know. I think there are a lot of contributions that still need to be made. My real concern regarding people with disabilities is that they are still treated as second-class citizens in New Jersey and in the United States. They have been denied their civil, human, and due process rights, and I see no improvement over time regarding that.
I noticed that when you received your award in December of 2012, you said that the work of the Disabilities Activist Movement was just beginning, and that's something you've just reinforced, that what progress has been made in recent decades is more cosmetic than substantive. If I follow you, I believe that's what you were saying.
How are you doing at the moment, Sal? Are you healthy?
I'm doing well and keeping very busy. But regarding what your colleague just said, all improvements have been cosmetic in that we have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, neither of which have been enforced over time. And that is a real problem, a real issue of concern. Plus, no law, no statute can really change the attitude of society as a whole. And until that changes, no law, no state law, no federal law will be effective in terms of improving the lives of people with disabilities.
That's very sobering.
Sal, I have a question, Sal. At the end of the 70s, in the beginning of the 80s, there seemed to me to be a movement toward improvement with children's rights and treatment of children and prevention of child abuse, and there seemed to be some real reforms taking place. There's this, even with the environment, the EPA was formed, and there were Superfund sites and that were cleaned up by the corporations that was funded at the time. Do you, in the work with the disabled, was there any improvement at that time? And we've had backsliding. We certainly have in the areas that I just mentioned. Has there been any backsliding?
Legislatively, the one thing that happened in the 70s that was significant was the passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. At the time, it was called the Educational Handicapped Act. Later, the title was changed in 1991. That law was introduced on the Senate side by our then United States Senator from New Jersey, Harrison Williams. That was significant in that it guaranteed a free and appropriate education to all children with disabilities in the United States. That was landmark. Not only was it an entitlement act, it was a piece of civil rights legislation. The problem is when we look over time at the success rate of the graduates of the country's high school special ed programs, that the success rate is very poor. So we have not really done our job. We passed legislation and created programs that really are not improving the lives of the handicapped children that we intended it to do. And what we see in that population is a very high degree of unemployment, a very low degree of true community acquiescence, being really part of the community. So that issue really needs to be answered in terms of have we improved the lives of these children. Up until this point, I would have to say no. It definitely has not improved their lives.
Sal, I have a question for you. Have you been reading news reports about the possibility of Social Security disability, to put it bluntly, going broke by 2016?
Yes, I've heard these messages. quite frequently, and really for the past 5 or 6 years. As you know, there has been an attack on all Social Security, saying that sooner or later, the amount of money that's being paid in by those of us in the workforce will not equal the amount of money that's being paid out. The Social Security disability payments are in real trouble, and I've heard different numbers than you. I've heard that they would be running out as soon as next year.
Wow. Okay. Now, what lobbying efforts are underway to protect the quality of life for the disabled under that portion of the safety net?
Well, there really is no safety net there. My position has always been that in addition to disability insurance, we need to create an environment in which we will have more and more people with disabilities who will not necessarily need disability insurance. Right now, the employability rate among people with disabilities as opposed to the non-disabled population is that people with disabilities have 3 times the unemployment rate of their non-disabled peers. That needs to be changed. We found that a lot of these people are employable, but there is a stigma that's attached to all people with disabilities. There's the old scenario that we used to talk about way back when I was in college, that someone can have an outstanding resume and outstanding credentials, but the moment that they come into an office for an interview, seated in a wheelchair, basically they will be told by the prospective employer, well, that position's already been filled, we don't really need you right now, but we'll call you if things change. That attitude, that stigma has not changed over time.
Right.
I'll give you a concrete example. When I was a doctoral student at Columbia University many decades ago, there was a case that arose regarding a graduate of the Columbia University Business School. And among the top 5 business schools in the country, being Harvard and Yale and Columbia among the 3 of those 5, those graduates did not even have to apply for a job. They were offered jobs on Wall Street the moment that they walked into the business school. And they were highly recruited. And there was this one particular individual who had an outstanding academic record who did not receive an offer from anyone. And whenever he applied for a job, basically, he wasn't on paper turned down and was basically told that he was not needed at the moment. Then that individual was a quadriplegic. And it became a really big focus for the disability movement. But I'm sad to say that the action that individual took did not go anywhere. It really did not change the lives of prospective employees with disabilities.
Okay.
Sal, why do you think it's such a recalcitrant prejudice? Why do you think it
well, you know what I found? That there are... First of all, I've learned 2 things over time. Now, I have to tell you that I've been in this field of disability services for 43 years. And what's not changed over time is this feeling among the general population as a whole that people with disabilities are less human than we are. They are not the same. And the only group within the population, within the non-disabled population, that thinks this differently are those people with a member of their family who has a disability. They see things differently. They see that person with a disability as no different than the rest of us. But society as a whole does not see someone with a disability as equal. And that, unfortunately, has not changed. And we've had tons of legislation, tons of social policy initiatives that really have not changed. And I would give you as an example, in New Jersey, we have a law that predates the Americans with Disabilities Act by 3 states, and it's called the NJLAD, the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination. On paper, it is stronger than the Americans with Disabilities Act. On paper, it's stronger than Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Yet it's done little to change the lives of people with disabilities. Part of the reason why it hasn't, is that people with disabilities themselves and members of their families do not know or understand their rights under the law. So they rarely take legal action. And what I have learned over time is that no piece of legislation and no legal statute can make any difference unless it's enforced. Now, Section 504 is really enforced. The ADA is really enforced for those two very different reasons, I would suppose. But the one piece of disability legislation that is enforced in the terms of litigation is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, because there are more people fighting for the rights of children with disabilities than there are for adults. The unfortunate part is that upon graduation from special education programs, the students, as I indicated before, are rarely employable, rarely live independently, rarely earn more than minimum wage any time in their lives, rarely hold a job for more than 3 months. There's been many studies regarding this, the first being a study as early as 1977 to find out if the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was making any difference. And those numbers have not changed over time.
I have a question, Sal. Is there a nation in the world, Western Europe, Canada, anywhere, that is more progressive in its compassion?
There are many. The interesting thing is that, as you probably know, there is a piece that's part of the movement within the United Nations, and it's called the Congress on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the CRPD. The United States is the only industrialized nation that did not sign on to it. And we have been trying literally since the end of World War II, because this section of the bylaws of the United Nations Charter was started in 1947. The most recent effort has been led by Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who's chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Over time, the Congress has failed to pass a resolution that would ask the president to ratify the CRPD. And the reasons that were given basically by very conservative members of the United States Senate are that the United States would be signing away its rights. But virtually every industrialized nation is ahead of us. The strongest nations regarding services with disabilities are the Scandinavian nations, Sweden, Denmark, so forth and so on. They've always been way ahead of us. They were the first nations really to put together programs for people with disabilities. I hate to say that this great country of ours is dead last in disability services, again, among the industrialized nations.
I'm not surprised to hear your comments.
Well,
right.
Senator Menendez has 2 hearings in recent months, 2 hearings of his Foreign Relations Committee in trying to drum up enough support to get the United States to sign on. The president cannot sign on unilaterally. He needs the permission of the Congress, and no president has received permission from the Congress since that part of the United States Charter was created back in 1947.
I was listening to the radio, reading newspapers about the budget agreement that the Senate and House have reached to fund the government through 2015, and I was wondering whether that meant that there is an underlying plan on the part of both parties to work more cooperatively. If there is...
Unfortunately, just to let you know, I served on Capitol Hill for members of the Congress 35 years ago. And I would say that this is the most partisan Congress that I have seen during my professional lifetime. And it's really unfortunate. When I mentioned the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that was passed in 1975, sponsored by our Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey, that was truly a bipartisan bill that mandated a free and appropriate education for all children with disabilities. The overall percentage of members of the Congress who voted in favor of it was 97%. That would never happen today. What's interesting about that bill, it was passed overwhelmingly by 97% of the members of both houses, and it went to the president's desk for signature. The president at that time was Gerald Ford, and it sat on Gerald Ford's desk for 8 days and refused to sign it. And he said that it was not the right of the United States government to dictate to the states and the local school districts around the country what their education policy should be. He eventually signed it because those people who spearheaded that bill, and that was Harrison Williams in the Senate and John Bradamus in the House of Representatives, and they came up with numbers that were even stronger. They found out that when they did a head count, that the number of members of the Congress who would vote to override the president's veto was closer to 99%. So politically, Gerald Ford had to sign it. There's always been someone who stood in the way, in my opinion, of progress for people with disabilities. But there was a nonpartisan effort on the parts of both houses of Congress and both parties to support any movement to improve the lives of people with disabilities. That has changed over time. And it's really sad because progress is really being held up. And the concrete example is the CRPD, our failure as a nation to sign on to the United Nations Congress on the rights of people with disabilities.
Well, I really appreciate your candor in recognizing that the partisanship of this Congress the polarization is not going to disappear overnight just because a budget agreement has been reached. And I do recognize that the Scandinavian countries are at least a generation, maybe more than that, ahead of the United States. But I think it might be a convenient moment to ask you about your memories of Senator Harrison Williams and what enabled him psychologically, intellectually, and politically to see the picture that you see, that we see, members of this panel of this program, that the disabled should not be ignored. He seemed.
Well, there was one thing that was in existence in New Jersey at the time, and our senator from New Jersey, one of them, Harrison Williams, really keyed into that. We had a piece of statewide legislation dating back to 1954 that basically supported the same goals of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was called the Beatleston Act. It was passed by the state legislature in 1954, and it was signed by several governors, Robert Minor being one of them in the 50s, and that guaranteed a public education for children with disabilities in New Jersey. We were the only state among the 50s, at the time there were 48 states, that guaranteed that education. And that was a period in our nation's history when someone with severe disability was hidden in closets, not only by society but by the very families. People were ashamed to say that they had a significantly impaired member of their family, and they basically were not allowed into school doorways. They were not afforded a public education, and they were automatically sent away to residential institutions. There was very little opportunity, if any, for them to become true members of society. But Harrison Williams keyed into our Beatleston legislation in New Jersey, and he used that as a premise for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That served as the draft for the federal law as was written during the early 1970s. And again, that was landmark. And what was really interesting about it is that there were two issues that occurred in the United States prior to that, without which the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act would not have passed. And I have to say, one is very sad, the assassination of JFK, because there would have been no civil rights legislation for anyone until Lyndon Johnson took the reins, and there was a fervor within the United States to support any of JFK's initiatives. The second one was another negative issue, the Watergate scandal, because as a result of both the assassination of JFK and the Watergate scandals, more liberals were elected to the Congress than ever before during those two periods, the 1964 congressional elections and the 1974 congressional elections. That allowed us to, one, right after the assassination of JFK, to pass the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which today is called No Child Left Behind. And that included, during its first reauthorization, the language that would support programs for children with disabilities in school settings. Did not guarantee anything at that time. That did not come until 1975. But then in 75, in response to the Watergate scandal, we had more liberals than ever before elected to the Congress, and that was a group that was willing to have the federal government have a presence in the education of our children. Up until then, it was a strong position, especially among the conservative members of the Congress, that the federal government should play no role in public education. That should be left up to the states and the local school districts. But again, I have to add, yeah, sure, please.
So don't you think that the entire tenor of the country shifted not just because of Watergate, but then the fact that Ellsberg could have access, that this could all come to light because of the anti-war movement, the Civil War movement that preceded it, the anti-war movement, and there was a liberalization where I think we pulled everybody to the left a bit more then.
There's no question, Daniel. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
We had Earth Day. There were a lot of reforms that happened around that time, and in the context of that, we brought down a president. That movement at the time stopped the war and brought down a president, and I think shifted the entire nation.
No, I agree with you. With the one proviso that had those elections, the 1974 congressional elections, not occurred the way they did, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, now the IDEA, would not have been passed. And had not Lyndon Johnson not come up with this great liberal domestic agenda as a result of JFK's assassination, which basically tried to replicate JFK's domestic agenda, not necessarily his international agenda. That was very different. But had that not happened, there would have been no education, no Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. And without the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 65, there would have been no Education of All Handicapped Children Act 10 years later in 75. So I would have to say without those two events, we would have fewer rights. In fact, let me give you another example of what took place during the last year of Richard Nixon's administration. We all know about Section 504. It's talked about so much. But Section 504 was one particular section of the Rehabilitation Act. And there was, at that time, it was only one paragraph. Today, the rules and regs alone are over 1,000 pages. But that one paragraph said that people with disabilities should not be discriminated against in work and educational settings. It was very short and to the point. But it was such a threat to conservatives that Richard Nixon vetoed it twice. One time was a pocket veto. Eventually they were forced to override that. The Congress threatened to override the veto, same as they did with Joe Ford later with the Education Act. And that was certainly a foot in the door in terms of establishing some rights for people with disabilities originally in the workplace. And Section 5 is still applied, as you probably know, in all areas not only in the workplace but in society in general. And, in fact, the reason why if you walk through a building and walk into a stairwell, there's a little strip of paint, usually yellow but sometimes it's black, on each step so that someone with a visual impairment can distinguish one step from another. That would have not happened. We would not have had handicapped parking spaces. It started very little, but today the role for 504 is much bigger. Again, those pieces of legislation, the IDEA, 504, and the ADA, are only good if they're enforced, and they're only enforced when people who become the victims of discrimination, whether in the educational setting or in housing or employment, when they decide to assert their rights. And unfortunately, very few people who are victims of discrimination because of disability actually assert their rights. Very few of them are aware of their rights under the law.
You know, I'm just, again, it's almost a theoretical question as why this population, when I look at the course of history, and of course we're not done with racism, sexism is horrible. Children are still bottom of the totem pole in the U.S. The U.S. is the worst offender with children worldwide. But I wonder, it seems to me that the disabled population has made the least progress. And
yes, I believe
I don't
that's
want to
true.
say I don't want to say it's because they're not that I'm fully disabled. I don't want to say it's because the disabled don't speak up for ourselves. I don't want to blame the victim. It seems to me that there's a greater prejudice in the population.
And that prejudice exists among those of us who believe that we're not prejudiced. In other words, we all have a bias somewhere, whether consciously or subconsciously, but we tell ourselves that we do not discriminate against any particular group. And I'll give you an example. I don't know if any of us, I remember being in a supermarket once when someone in a motorized wheelchair that was very large was what I felt blocking the aisle in the supermarket. Of course, they didn't say anything, but I thought to myself, wow, that person is really, he's making it more difficult for us to shop, of course. And of all people, as I walked out, I said, given my career and things I do, the first thing I should have thought of is that without that motorized wheelchair, that person would not have been able to shop independently. And I realized that many of us, inner feelings of discrimination that we deny among ourselves. And unless we're open about it, we'll not be able to basically to nullify that discrimination not only among ourselves but among others. There are lots of employers out there who are convinced that they do not discriminate against people with disabilities, yet they'll never hire someone with a disability because they think that it will interfere with business. They'll think that, if a prospective client walks into the office and sees someone with a wheelchair will be unattractive, or because if they see someone with a disability at a lunch counter or behind a desk, that will be unattractive, and the clients become fewer and fewer. I would like to think that is not the case. But even among those employers who feel that they don't discriminate, there is discrimination. I will just tell you, as someone who represents people with disabilities at the Office of Administrative Law in New Jersey, that people with disabilities are discriminated against in the courts, not only by judges, not only by opposing attorneys, but by the very attorneys who represent those people with disabilities. They tend to make decisions for them, assuming that because the person has a disability, any kind of disability, whether it's a physical disability or a cognitive disability, an emotional disability, psychiatric disability, that they're unable to make decisions, and that's not necessarily the case. We know that regarding involuntary civil commitment, that people with disabilities are committed involuntarily to hospitals only because the judge cannot interpret whether or not that person is a danger to his or herself or others. And that's the criteria for involuntary civil commitment in the United States and nationally, according to the U.S. Supreme Court. That person must be a danger to his or herself or others. And if the person refuses their medication, which is their right, and there have been all kinds of Supreme Court decisions establishing that all of us have a right to refuse medical treatment or medication, but the judge will view that refusal as to mean that that person is a danger to him or herself or others. So the dichotomy there is that because that person is asserting their individual civil rights, now suddenly it's okay to deprive them of another right and commit them involuntarily. So it's in all assets of society. It's not just in the school districts. It's not just in employment. It's in the courts. It's in housing. It's prevalent, and much more prevalent than those among the non-disabled population care to admit or understand.
Let me ask you a question, Sal, from what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that Senator Williams was not some passionate, wild-eyed liberal in his time. It was a standard liberal in his time, rather than an exceptional one. Is that correct?
Harrison Williams who would be considered very liberal today. He would probably be, based on his positions, he would probably be considered among the 2 or 3 most liberal members of the United States Congress if he were alive and serving today. But I think he had a strong belief in the civil rights of every person. Now, I am biased in that I was just in awe of him when he was alive, and I was in awe of him when he was serving on Capitol Hill. He left the Congress under unfortunate circumstances, but I thought he was a person without whom we would have made very little progress in the lives of people with disabilities. And there were 1 or 2 people in the Congress who did that, who never received recognition. And it was not just a Democrat like Harrison Williams. It was a Republican like Lowell Weicker of Connecticut, who made great changes every time we reauthorized the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. He extended those rights, which at the time were beginning at age 5 for a school child, all the way down to birth. Another was Senator Bob Stafford of Vermont, who was another Republican, who was one of the strongest advocates for the rights of all people with disabilities. And I was just in awe of those people. They were not necessarily liberals. Certainly Bob Stafford of Vermont was not. At the time, he was considered a conservative Republican in a liberal state, coming from a liberal state. But he was a very strong supporter of rights of people with disabilities. But there's one thing that Lowell Weicker and Bob Stafford and our former Vice President Hubert Humphrey had together. Hubert Humphrey was a great supporter in the Senate. They all had a member of their family that had a significant disability. In Lowell Weicker's case, it was a granddaughter. In Hubert Humphrey's case, it was also a granddaughter. In Bob Stafford's case, it was his daughter. Now, there were many cases like that. And who's to say if JFK did not have a member of his family with disability, if anything would have changed? And as I mentioned earlier, it's been my experience that unless a member of the non-disabled population has had a member of their family with a disability and then able to empathize with and understand the trials and tribulations that those people go through, they're less likely to be concerned about the rights of this forgotten population. I call it the voiceless population.
Sal, I think your historical references and Williams are just invaluable.
We'll have to have you on again, Sal, because we're almost out of time. We're down to our last 46 seconds. So we'd love to have you come back and talk to us some more
about the scenario for the future.
And Jan, you're
Wonderful.
Still there, right?
I am. I would really love to be able to talk to Sal about the mentally ill because I have, being a therapist and having worked with that population, we talked about that, Sal, before he came on. I have a little bit of a different take on it, and I'd love to have that conversation because it's a...
I'd love to have that conversation. As you may or may not know, a big part of my work today is dealing with the rights of people with mental illness, emotional illness, psychiatric illness, et cetera. And it's no different. They are discriminated, in my opinion, more than any else, any
much more.
other group within the disability milieu. Now, unfortunately, there are government entities and courts that don't agree with that, but I see that as part of the voiceless population.
I agree. There are just some medical issues.
Well, this has been excellent, Sal. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your contribution this evening. I look forward to talking with you again.
See you back again next week, Jan, hopefully. Julie and Bob had to drop off early tonight. So thank you so much, Sal, and thank you, Jan, for your contribution, and we'll talk to both of you again soon.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.